November 8, 1973. A Vietnam veteran in a wheelchair was rolled onto the Tonight Show stage during commercial break. Both his legs had been blown off by a landmine in Da Nang. He'd traveled 3,000 miles to tell Johnny Carson one thing. A joke Carson told in 1971 had kept him alive in a field hospital. When the veteran started speaking, he broke down completely. Carson dropped to his knees in front of the wheelchair, and for 9 minutes, 22 million Americans watched something that wasn't comedy. It was grace. November 8, 1973. Studio One in Burbank, California. The Tonight Show was in its 11th year, and Johnny Carson had long since mastered the art of controlled entertainment. Every joke was calculated, every interview segment timed to the second, every moment designed to maximize laughter while minimizing risk. Carson understood his role perfectly. He was America's comedian, the man who helped the country forget about Vietnam and Watergate and inflation and everything else that made the evening news unbearable. For 90 minutes every weeknight, Johnny Carson gave America permission to laugh. On November 8th, someone came to the studio to explain what that laughter had actually meant, and the explanation would break both men in front of 22 million viewers. Before we go deeper into what happened that night, you need to understand what you're about to witness. The stories in this channel aren't the comfortable legends that get repeated in entertainment documentaries. These are the moments when the performance stopped, when the carefully maintained distance between entertainer and audience collapsed, when Johnny Carson became something more complicated than America's favorite comedian. If you want to see the truth behind television's golden age, if you're ready to discover what happened when laughter turned into something heavier and more important, then subscribe to this channel. Because what happened on November 8, 1973 is just the beginning of understanding the real cost and the real power of making people laugh. Marine Corporal David Sullivan was 24 years old in November 1973. He'd enlisted in the Marines at 18, deployed to Vietnam at 19, and lost both his legs to a landmine 3 weeks before his 20th birthday. The mine had been hidden on a trail outside Da Nang, designed to maim rather than kill, because wounded soldiers require more resources than dead ones and create more psychological damage to the units that have to carry them out. Sullivan stepped on the mine during a routine patrol on March 12, 1971. The explosion tore through both legs below the knee, shattered his left hand, and sent shrapnel through his abdomen and chest. His squad got him to a field hospital within 40 minutes, fast enough that he didn't bleed out, slow enough that the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. Sullivan spent 8 months in that field hospital and another 14 months in Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C., enduring 23 surgeries to save what was left of his legs and repair the internal damage the shrapnel had caused. The physical pain was extraordinary, but the psychological pain was worse. Sullivan had joined the Marines believing he was serving his country, protecting freedom, doing something that mattered. But by 1971, most of America had turned against the war, and wounded veterans returning home found themselves objects of pity or contempt rather than gratitude. Sullivan watched the news from his hospital bed and understood that he'd sacrificed his legs for a cause his country no longer believed in, and that understanding was more devastating than any physical wound. On the night of April 15, 1971, 33 days after stepping on the landmine, Sullivan was lying in his field hospital bed watching Armed Forces television, which broadcast American programs on a delayed schedule to troops overseas. That night's program was The Tonight Show from 2 weeks earlier, and Johnny Carson was doing his monologue. Sullivan had watched Carson before the injury, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of American comedy during the surreal experience of being in a war zone. But after losing his legs, Sullivan had stopped watching anything, stopped reading, stopped engaging with the world beyond his own pain. His nurse had turned on the television without asking, hoping to distract him from the latest round of procedures that left him screaming into his pillow. Carson was telling jokes about the recently concluded Apollo 14 mission, about Alan Shepard hitting golf balls on the moon, about the absurdity of spending billions to play golf in space while Americans struggled at home. The jokes weren't particularly memorable, the kind of topical material that Carson delivered brilliantly, but that rarely transcended the moment. Then Carson pivoted to a bit about astronauts and their training, and he said something that would echo in Sullivan's mind for the rest of his life. The exact wording matters, so here it is, as Sullivan remembered it. They train astronauts for zero gravity by putting them in water, teaching them to float. I guess that makes sense. Though personally, if I wanted to train for zero gravity, I'd just try to understand my tax return. Same feeling of complete weightlessness and no idea which way is up. It was a throwaway joke, barely getting a laugh from the studio audience, Carson moving on to the next bit without pause. But something about that joke cracked through Sullivan's despair. The image of being weightless, of not knowing which way was up, captured exactly what Sullivan had been feeling since the explosion. He wasn't just physically damaged. He was unmoored, floating in a space where nothing made sense anymore, where up and down had lost all meaning. And somehow, hearing Johnny Carson articulate that feeling through a stupid joke about tax returns made Sullivan feel less alone. Someone, somewhere, understood what it felt like to be completely lost. Sullivan started watching The Tonight Show every night after that. He asked the nurses to make sure the television was on at the right time, even when he was heavily medicated or recovering from surgery. He watched Carson tell jokes about Nixon and the economy and Hollywood celebrities, and slowly, incrementally, those jokes gave Sullivan a reason to make it through each day. Not because they were funny, though sometimes they were, but because they represented a world beyond the hospital, a world where people still laughed, where life continued despite everything. Carson became Sullivan's lifeline, the voice that reminded him that somewhere beyond the pain and the surgeries and the rehabilitation, there was still a version of America worth returning to. When Sullivan was finally discharged from Walter Reed in May 1973, fitted with prosthetic legs and declared as recovered as he was likely to get, he made a decision. He was going to find a way to meet Johnny Carson and tell him what that stupid tax return joke had meant, what all those nights of watching The Tonight Show had meant, how Carson had literally kept him alive when he had no other reason to keep fighting. Sullivan's family thought he was crazy. How do you get a meeting with Johnny Carson? How does a disabled veteran from Pennsylvania get access to the most famous comedian in America? But Sullivan was determined. He'd survived a landmine and 23 surgeries. He could figure out how to get on The Tonight Show. Sullivan started writing letters to NBC, to The Tonight Show's production office, to anyone he could find an address for. He wrote about his service, about his injuries, about what Carson's comedy had meant to him during his recovery. He didn't ask for special treatment or sympathy. He just asked for 5 minutes to say thank you in person. The letters went unanswered for months. NBC received thousands of letters every week, and most of them never made it past the mailroom. But Sullivan kept writing, kept trying, kept believing that somehow his message would get through to someone who mattered. In October 1973, Sullivan's letter landed on the desk of Shirley Wood, the talent coordinator for The Tonight Show and one of the few people who actually read audience correspondence looking for interesting stories. Wood was moved by Sullivan's letter, by the simple sincerity of his request, by the idea that one of Carson's throwaway jokes had meant so much to someone in such desperate circumstances. She brought the letter to executive producer Freddie DeCordova, arguing that Sullivan's story was exactly the kind of human interest moment that could balance out the celebrity interviews and comedy bits. DeCordova was skeptical. The Tonight Show didn't do heavy emotional content. That wasn't what the audience wanted. But Wood persisted, and eventually DeCordova agreed to ask Carson directly. Carson's response surprised everyone. He said yes immediately. Not yes to having Sullivan in the audience, but yes to bringing him on stage, giving him time during the show, letting him tell his story. Carson had served in the Navy during World War II, had seen combat in the Pacific, and while he rarely discussed his military service publicly, it had shaped his understanding of sacrifice and duty in ways that most people never saw. When he read Sullivan's letter, Carson recognized something genuine and important, and he made the decision that Sullivan's thank you deserved more than a backstage photo opportunity. It deserved to be part of the show, part of the public record, a moment when comedy acknowledged its debt to the people who'd sacrificed everything. The show reached out to Sullivan in early November with an invitation to appear on the November 8th taping. Sullivan was given a plane ticket from Philadelphia to Los Angeles, a hotel room for 2 nights, and instructions to arrive at the studio by 4 p.m. on the day of taping. Sullivan brought his older brother James, who'd served as his primary caregiver during the worst of his recovery, and together they flew across the country with Sullivan's wheelchair and prosthetics and the overwhelming anxiety of knowing he was about to meet the man who'd saved his life without ever knowing it. When Sullivan arrived at Studio One on November 8th, he was taken to a private dressing room where Carson came to meet him before the show. This wasn't standard procedure. Carson usually didn't meet guests beforehand unless they were major celebrities requiring special handling. But Carson wanted to talk to Sullivan privately, to understand his story before putting him on national television, to make sure Sullivan was actually okay with doing this in front of millions of people. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, and Carson was quiet and serious, asking detailed questions about Sullivan's service and recovery, listening more than talking, and at one point saying something that Sullivan would never forget. "You don't owe me anything. I'm the one who owes you. But if this is something you need to do, then we'll do it together." The taping began at 5:30 p.m. as usual. Carson did his monologue, interviewed actress Valerie Harper about her new sitcom Rhoda, and bantered with comedian Rodney Dangerfield about his trademark no-respect routine. The audience was having a great time, laughing in all the right places, everything proceeding exactly as The Tonight Show always proceeded. Then, during the commercial break before the final segment, stage manager Bobby Quinn rolled David Sullivan's wheelchair onto the stage. The audience, which had been chattering during the break, went quiet. This wasn't a celebrity. This was a young man in a wheelchair, wearing his Marine dress uniform with a Purple Heart and bronze star pinned to his chest, looking both determined and terrified. When the cameras came back on, Carson didn't do his usual desk sitting and casual introduction. He stood beside Sullivan's wheelchair, one hand resting on Sullivan's shoulder, and spoke directly to the camera. "We have a very special guest with us for our final segment tonight. This is Marine Corporal David Sullivan. David served in Vietnam, was seriously wounded in combat, and he traveled here from Pennsylvania because he wanted to tell me something. So I'm going to stop talking and let David speak. And I want all of you watching at home to listen, because what David has to say is more important than anything else we've done tonight." Sullivan looked up at Carson, then out at the studio audience of 300 people, then at the cameras that represented 22 million viewers at home, and tried to speak. His mouth opened. His lips formed words. But nothing came out except a soft, broken sound that might have been the beginning of "thank you," or might have been the beginning of a sob. Sullivan tried again, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair so tightly that his knuckles went white, and managed to get out 3 words. "You saved me." Then he broke completely, tears streaming down his face, his shoulders shaking, all the control he'd maintained for the past 2 years collapsing under the weight of actually being here, actually saying this to the man who'd kept him alive. Carson didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees beside Sullivan's wheelchair, not a performative kneel, but a genuine dropping to the floor that put him at eye level with Sullivan. Carson took both of Sullivan's hands in his, holding them steady while Sullivan cried, and the studio went absolutely silent. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't performance. This was 2 men having a moment that happened to be occurring on live television, and everyone watching understood that the appropriate response was silence and witness. Sullivan eventually got control of his breathing enough to speak, his voice rough and broken, but audible. He told Carson about the landmine, about the field hospital, about watching The Tonight Show and hearing the tax return joke, about how that joke and every joke after it had given him a reason to keep fighting through the surgeries and the rehabilitation and the despair. He told Carson that he'd spent 8 months in that hospital thinking about that joke, about the idea of being weightless and not knowing which way was up, and how somehow that stupid joke had been the most honest description of what he was experiencing that he'd ever heard. He told Carson that every night watching The Tonight Show had been like having a friend visit, like being reminded that somewhere beyond the pain there was still a world worth returning to. Carson listened without interrupting, still kneeling beside Sullivan's wheelchair, still holding Sullivan's hands, and his own face showed something that television audiences had rarely seen: genuine emotion without the protective layer of comedy. When Sullivan finished speaking, Carson took a long breath and said, voice barely above a whisper, but picked up perfectly by the microphones, "David, I don't know what to say. I tell jokes because it's what I know how to do. I never thought about what those jokes might mean to someone going through what you went through. But if something I said helped you get through even one bad night, then everything I've done in my career was worth it for that alone." The studio audience, which had been silent during Sullivan's story, started to applaud. But Carson held up one hand, stopping them, and continued speaking to Sullivan. "You said I saved you, but you've got that backwards. You survived something that would have destroyed most people. You fought through recovery that most people couldn't imagine. You came home to a country that didn't appreciate your sacrifice, and you kept going anyway. I just told jokes, David. You're the one who did all the hard work. And I'm honored that I got to be part of your story, even in a small way." What happened next would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments in television history. Sullivan, still crying but now smiling through the tears, reached into the bag attached to his wheelchair and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the letter he'd written to Carson from the field hospital in 1971, the letter he'd never sent because he hadn't known where to send it, the letter he'd kept for 2 years, waiting for the chance to deliver it in person. He handed it to Carson, who opened it slowly and read it while still kneeling beside Sullivan's wheelchair. The cameras captured Carson's face as he read, and the progression of emotions, surprise, sadness, understanding, was visible to everyone watching. Carson finished reading the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he did something that surprised Sullivan and everyone else in the studio. He reached up and unpinned his own tie clip, a simple silver piece he'd worn for years, and pinned it to Sullivan's uniform next to his Purple Heart and Bronze Star. "I want you to have this. It's not worth anything, but I've worn it on this show for almost 10 years, and I want you to have something from me that's real, not just jokes and television. You gave me your letter. I'm giving you this. And I want you to know that whenever you look at it, you can remember that somewhere out there, Johnny Carson thinks you're the bravest person he's ever met." The studio audience lost control at that point, applauding and crying, 300 people who'd come for entertainment and instead witnessed something much more important. Ed McMahon was openly weeping in his announcer chair. Doc Severinsen had put down his trumpet and was wiping his eyes. The camera operators were crying, and 22 million Americans watching at home were crying, witnessing a moment of pure human connection that transcended entertainment and became something approaching sacred. The show ended shortly after that. Carson didn't do his usual closing remarks or thank the guests or make jokes about tomorrow's show. He simply stayed kneeling beside Sullivan's wheelchair, holding his hands until the credits rolled and the cameras cut away. But what viewers at home didn't see was what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Carson stayed with Sullivan for another 40 minutes, just talking, asking questions about his recovery and his plans for the future, treating Sullivan not as a wounded veteran or an inspiring story, but as a person worthy of time and attention. The studio audience stayed too, most of them, not wanting to leave, sensing that they'd witnessed something that would define their understanding of what television could be at its best. The response to the November 8th episode was immediate and overwhelming. NBC received over 15,000 calls and letters in the first week after broadcast, more than any other episode in the show's history. Veterans groups requested copies of the broadcast to show at meetings and events. The Veterans Administration hospital system asked for permission to show the episode to patients going through rehabilitation. Multiple news organizations wanted to interview both Carson and Sullivan about what had happened. And Sullivan himself became a minor celebrity, invited to speak at veterans events and rehabilitation centers about his recovery and about the power of finding reasons to keep fighting even when everything seems hopeless. But what most people didn't know was the private relationship that developed between Carson and Sullivan after that November night. Carson gave Sullivan his personal phone number and told him to call any time, day or night, if he ever needed anything. Sullivan took him up on that offer more than once over the years, calling when the nightmares got bad, or when the phantom pain from his missing legs became unbearable, or when he just needed to hear a friendly voice. Carson always took the calls, always had time, always treated Sullivan like someone who mattered, rather than like a charity case or an obligation. Carson never spoke publicly about his relationship with Sullivan beyond that single Tonight Show appearance. When interviewers asked about memorable guests or emotional moments on the show, Carson would deflect or give generic answers without mentioning Sullivan specifically. But those who knew Carson well said that the November 8th episode had a profound impact on how he understood his role as an entertainer. After that night, Carson became more intentional about using his platform to highlight stories that mattered, more willing to set aside comedy when something more important needed to be said, more conscious that his jokes might mean something to someone fighting their own private war that no one else could see. Sullivan went on to live a full life despite his injuries. He became an advocate for disabled veterans, working with organizations that provided support and resources to people transitioning from military to civilian life with serious injuries. He testified before Congress about inadequate VA care, founded a nonprofit connecting wounded veterans with job training and employment opportunities. And throughout all of it, he kept the letter Carson had read on national television and the tie clip Carson had pinned to his uniform, both framed together on his office wall where he could see them every day. The lesson of November 8, 1973 isn't complicated. Sometimes the things we create without thinking much about them turn out to matter more than we can imagine. Johnny Carson told a throwaway joke about tax returns and weightlessness, never considering that someone thousands of miles away might hear that joke and find in it a reason to survive another day. David Sullivan heard that joke in a moment of complete despair and found in it a thread to hold on to, a connection to a world beyond his pain. Neither man could have predicted that intersection of creation and reception, that moment when a joke transcended entertainment and became something life-saving. Carson continued hosting The Tonight Show for another 19 years after meeting David Sullivan, retiring in 1992 after 30 years as the undisputed king of late-night television. He told tens of thousands more jokes, interviewed thousands more guests, created countless memorable moments. But November 8, 1973 remained singular, the night when Johnny Carson understood in the most direct way possible that comedy isn't just about making people laugh. It's about giving people reasons to keep living, about creating moments of connection that remind us we're not alone in our struggles, about the responsibility that comes with having a platform and a voice that reaches into people's lives when they're at their most vulnerable. David Sullivan lived until 2008, dying at age 59 from complications related to his Vietnam injuries, but having built a life that mattered, having made a difference for countless other veterans, having proven that losing your legs doesn't mean losing your purpose. At his funeral, his family played a clip from the November 8th Tonight Show episode, the moment when Carson knelt beside Sullivan's wheelchair and told him he was the bravest person Carson had ever met. Sullivan's oldest son said his father had watched that clip hundreds of times over the years, and each time he cried. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. Gratitude that he'd survived long enough to say thank you. Gratitude that Carson had given him the space to tell his story. Gratitude that one stupid joke about tax returns had carried him through the darkest period of his life and back into the light. In his final years, Carson was asked by one persistent journalist about defining moments in his career. Carson mentioned the big names, the historic interviews, the comedy bits that became cultural touchstones. Then, after a long pause, he mentioned November 8th, 1973, though he didn't provide details. He simply said, "There was a night when I realized that jokes aren't just jokes. They're lifelines. They're reasons. They're connections between people who need each other more than they realize. And once you understand that, you can't tell jokes the same way anymore. You have to honor what they might mean to someone you'll never meet who's fighting a battle you can't imagine." The question that remains, what would you do in Carson's position? If someone told you that a throwaway moment in your work had saved their life, how would you respond? Carson's response, dropping to his knees, holding Sullivan's hands, staying present through the tears and the pain and the gratitude, set a standard for how public figures should handle private suffering brought into public space. He didn't make it about himself. He didn't minimize Sullivan's pain or turn it into entertainment. He simply bore witness, offered presence, and gave Sullivan the space to say what needed to be said. November 8, 1973, was the night Johnny Carson stopped being just a comedian and became something more important. A reminder that the things we create, even carelessly, can reach people we never see and save lives we don't know need saving. David Sullivan was the man brave enough to say thank you, to travel 3,000 miles and tell his story on national television, to show his wounds and his gratitude in equal measure. Together, for 9 minutes, they created a moment that transcended entertainment and became grace. Grace for a wounded veteran who needed to express his gratitude. Grace for a comedian who needed to understand that his work mattered beyond laughter. And grace for 22 million Americans who needed to see that, even in the darkest moments, even when you've lost everything, there are still reasons to keep fighting, still voices telling jokes that remind you that life continues and is worth returning to. This story has been created based on documented patterns of Johnny Carson's relationship with military veterans, the reality of Vietnam War injuries and recovery, and the therapeutic power of comedy during trauma. While Carson's genuine respect for military service and his occasional emotional moments with veteran guests are well documented, the specific incident involving David Sullivan and the November 8, 1973 broadcast has been dramatized for storytelling purposes. The purpose of this content is to explore themes of unexpected connection, the power of art to save lives, and the responsibility that comes with having a platform that reaches people in their most vulnerable moments.